It should, yeah, it should start to record. So should be good.
I got a recording in progress message.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. So for anyone that's joined, if you want to let us know where you're joining us from in the chat, and we're just going to give it a minute just to allow people to trickle through, and then we'll get started. Cool. So we can see we've got lots of people joining us. Haley from France. Um, it's good. Hi, Sharon. Hi, Simon. Jane. Jane. Um, cool. So I'll tell you what, let's get started. Because I know we've probably got a lot to get through. So welcome to today's Learning Network webinar, and thanks everybody for joining. So the Learning Network is a community run by volunteers supporting learning professionals with resources, mentoring, events, and just a general space to grow no matter your experience. So little bit of housekeeping. Today we're using Zoom. The session is being recorded and it will be available to members in the members resource dashboard shortly afterwards. I can see people are starting to use the chat, so feel free to uh, drop any questions in there, and I can make sure that Paul Paul is able to respond to those. And yeah, we'll have a time for a Q&A session at the end as well. So that's everything from me. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today Paul Matthews from People Alchemy, and he's going to be doing our second part, our second webinar on learning transfer, which is how to use technology to enable learning transfer at scale. So over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's really good to be here, and I thoroughly enjoyed the first part of the webinar that Melanie delivered a couple of weeks ago. So we will be plugging into some of that. But if you didn't go to that webinar, it's not a problem. We're not sort of building directly on it. We're taking our own path, so it's not like you need that as a prerequisite or anything like that. Um, so a little bit about me in the sense that I've been around the L&D community for 27 years or something now. Written a few books in that area, including one on learning transfer, and spoken at conferences and things around the world. And alongside that, I've got a software company with some niche learning software, which also works on some of the learning transfer principles. So I'm kind of well versed in the space. But aside from that, let's just get on with it. If you've got any questions along the way, please put them out to into the chat, and Arash will pick them up. And we will have a Q&A session at the end. So also you can save something up for there as well. So without further ado, as they say, I will get my slides shared, and then we can get things going. So now, hopefully, you should be able to see. Arash, is that all working well? We've got the slide shared.
Yeah, it's popped up, so can definitely
Brilliant.
see it.
There's all the official stuff at the beginning. I never, you know that. Um, and I often start stuff I do with elephants because I talked about the elephant in the room, and learning transfer is definitely one of those elephants in the L&D room. And I quite like this picture anyway. Plus, I've been spent time in Africa and been around elephants, and they're amazing creatures. They're also kind of sneaky when they're there getting in the way of something like learning. So here's a sneaky elephant stealing your coffee. I rather like that picture. I'm sure it's been digitally enhanced though somehow. Um, and so this is sort of like enemy action. And what we have to do is be aware of the gap between when people attend a training or do some kind of learning event, and then from there they go out and into the real world. And then what happens? And so there's this gap between the classroom and application in the classroom. So of course we're talking about a gap. So we obviously have to have a mind the gap picture. And this is where a lot of stuff gets lost. People leave the room, and we'll talk about sort of training and as a training event here for today because it sort of makes it easier. But what we're talking about will apply equally well for an e-learning event or any other kind of learning initiative where people learn stuff. We've got this. I don't know what the figures are exactly. There's so many around. Different research has been done, but certainly it's around 10 or 20% of training or of learning transfers sufficiently into the workplace after a training course that people can say that worked. And by that, I mean 10 to 20% of the learners. You'll get some learners will do absolutely nothing. And Melanie covered a bit of that in the last webinar. So I do encourage you, if you weren't at the last webinar, go and have a look at the recording of that one. And this is a little picture that I've used for a while now. And I can't even remember where I got it from. So I'm sorry about the provenance, but there's this idea that if you put people in a training room, then somehow magic happens and their behavior will change as a result of that. I'm not sure that there's too much magic around. There's certainly no sacks of pixie dust left in my closet. The definition that Melanie used a couple of weeks ago for learning transfer came from Dr. Navina Heidel's book, and it's a good definition. I like it. So it's the extent to which trainees or learners effectively use the knowledge and skills sort of back in their work environment. Does that learning make a difference in what they do back at work? And as I said, this could be any sort of learning event, formal or informal, but it's easy to talk about training. So that's what we'll do today. And the title of this talk sort of mentions tech. How can we use tech? And despite the title of this webinar, what what I don't recommend is you starting with the tech. It's the wrong place to start. It looks all shiny. It's wonderful. It's otherwise we end up with that bright shiny object syndrome. And for those of you who've been to sort of learning tech at Excel in London, every year there's these huge, noisy, big show with lots of technology on display. It's very easy to get sort of pulled sideways. So that looks amazing. Choosing the tech you're going to use comes a long way down the design path, unless, of course, the tech is already in place and you've got no options. So what I'm not going to be doing today is saying you should use this or that or Slack or Teams or this LMS or that. I'll be talking much more about the philosophy, some specific things to do. How you might want to do those things using tech then obviously depends on your sort of local situation. So first figure out what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And one of the things that always bothers me about sort of learning is very much what the barriers that we typically put in place ourselves when we're doing stuff. There's a lot of things we do traditionally in L&D where we treat training as an event, a one-off sort of discrete. It ends when the people leave the room. Whereas to me, it should be much more like a workflow, a continuous, structured, guided, and measured so that we can stay with these people over time while they do what we want them to do, which is to change their behavior. And really, an event-based approach, an event very seldom changes someone's behavior, and certainly not in a sustainable way. So it gets sort of the way they do things and becomes habitual. A lot more is required to bring that learning transfer through into a habitual behavior change. So that's kind of what we're talking a bit about today is how do we use tech to enable, to help people build that new behavior? And of course, the slide I've got, the picture up there at the moment, yes, there's always going to be a few who are going to ignore the road closed, ignore the things that we do, and just go ahead and learn anyway. And these tends to be the growth mindset people. They'll go on their own transfer journey despite what we do, not because of it. So there's always going to be that 10, 15% of people in a class who will grab the ball and run with it. These are the people going around there on the mud there. But what I just mentioned there is that behavior change is a process. It happens over time. It's behavior is something you build, a new behavior. It doesn't just pop into being because somebody learned something new. There's a process that's got to be wrapped around that thing that you've just learned that's new, to get people from where they are and doing what they're doing to a change in behavior, so they're doing something different instead of what they're doing. Because if you think about it, ultimately, what we're doing in L&D is seeking behavior change from people. We want them to change what they're doing, to do different things or do things differently, which is a lovely definition of learning that Robin Hoyle coined. And I think that's a great way to think about it. How do we get them doing different things and doing things differently than what they're doing now? Because if we don't want that change, that difference, then why are we doing any training at all? But it's really important that we think about that building a behavior. It's not something that just, as I said, pops into being. And as soon as you talk about building, you start getting the concept of time, of a period over which different activities have to take place to build it, a piece at a time to get to the point, where you have this new behavior that's kicked in. And the thing that actually that I keep thinking about here with this is, so this is a big number. And where I'm coming to with this is if you are going to create or build a new behavior, you may need to, on a regular basis over a period of time, do some specific activities like practice something, experiment with it, talk to a colleague, reflect on it, learn a little bit more about it. So there's all of these little activities that need to take place. So just imagine for a moment that you have 100 learners over a program that's running for 20 weeks, and over each week they need to do 5 little tasks. And those tasks would be quite small. Just think to yourself, where could I use this particular new idea this week? Or I go and talk to a colleague and ask them what they think about it. So those activities don't have to be big, but if you get 100 learners over 20 weeks with 5 tasks a week, you're talking about 10,000 activities, 10,000 touch points that you need to have. And this is what starts to happen when you scale. Now, if you've got 4 or 5 or 10 learners, you might be able to handle that manually. You can keep them going over that period of time. And you will need that period of time, as we've talked about. Behavior doesn't change overnight. It's very, very seldom we get that sort of road to Damascus conversion in the classroom, and they go back totally fixed. Remember that previously slide we had where magic happens between the classroom? Yeah, well, no, it doesn't, I'm afraid. So we have to bear in mind that in order to scale learning transfer, we've got some really big numbers that we're talking about in terms of the number of things that need to go on. And of course, that's just 100 learners I'm talking about. What if there's 500, 1,000? So we absolutely do need to get to technology in order to help learners build the behaviors that we want them to build over the period of time that the program runs for. So that starts to then beg the question is, how are we going to scaffold? Because whenever you're building something, you typically need some way to scaffold it, something that is going to add some structure to enable you to get up there and build high, not just put in. If you're talking this building analogy, for example, you might think of the training course as laying the foundations, pouring the concrete at the bottom. Now, that's the content. Now, from there, that's the knowledge. From there, you can start building on that out to operationalizing it and making it real activities, real change out in the workplace. So, in order to scale, you are going to need a scaffold, and technology can provide that. So, the sorts of things that a scaffold will give you is a structure for the build process. So if we are going to build up, the scaffold will be built around that almost as we go, or is built before it, and then you build the building inside it. It's the same with, behaviors. The behaviors will be built a piece at a time, an activity at a time, and the scaffold will provide that as a technology can provide that. It provides guidance for that process for the different actors and players involved. And also, it gives you a lot of good visibility of what's going on. And that's really critical when you are dealing with such large numbers of events and activities going on. How do you get a visibility of what's happening out there? So, a training course, typically, you just sort of, they leave the building, they leave the classroom, and that's it. There's not a lot follow-up after that. Or if there is some follow-up, it's usually in quite a small fashion, maybe a questionnaire, maybe an email out to a manager saying, oh, you need to ask them about this or something at some point. Most of the time when I talk to organizations, there's really not much done in that sense. But the way that learning transfer will happen is when you wrap what I call a workflow around that training course. And that makes all the difference. And that's what gives you the structure and the guidance. So, so what is a workflow? A workflow is just step-by-step actions that will get you from where you are to a defined end result. So the instructions in your sat nav make up a workflow, for example. You use a workflow when you go to the supermarket to go shopping. There's a sequence of things that you do over time that will get you out of your house to the supermarket, the right stuff in your trolley, paid for, hopefully, and then back home. So we're using workflows or sequences of activities all the time, often in a very informal sense. But you can set up formal workflows. And in many organizations, workflows are used for manufacturing, for processing documents through an insurance company, and so on. So I think we're pretty familiar with that concept, but it's not often used in a learning context. And I think it really should be. Because in order to get people to change their behavior, they're going to have to do a number of things over time in a workflow style. So that's the concept of a workflow. And what you need, so one step in that workflow is going to be the training course or the e-learning course or whatever. So here's a little question about activity. So start putting some of this in the chat. What activities need to happen to build behavior change? In other words, what needs to be in the workflow of things that need to go on in order for that behavior to be built by those people? Let's have some stuff in the chat.
Joe's put as close to real work as possible.
Yeah,
Um, Jen's said access to the right information, practice. Simon, planning how to overcome challenges.
that's a good
Uh,
one. What resistance is there?
Jenny Bush has put noticing the old behavior.
Uh, Yeah,
Uh,
that sort of refers back to measurement, doesn't it, a little bit? You know, how do we know we've made a change?
yeah, we've got time to experiment with new things
Yep.
learned, accountability, someone reviewing and providing feedback on their change,
Yep.
feedback on how you're doing, um, having time to embed new practices, practice, experimentation, exploration, reflection,
Yeah.
pleasure or shock. Haley's put perhaps very basically something that makes the people conscious of their own behavior and the gap with the behavior needed.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good one too. It's people have to be aware of what the output is for the end of this program. You know, what are we actually trying to achieve here? So in other words, but you notice a lot of those things that you guys are talking about there in that list don't happen in the classroom. They happen afterwards. Some of them might happen a little bit before. So you've kind of got three phases to this. You got a before, during, and after if we're talking about an event-based training. And but all the time there's there's one question actually I asked that, but without a lot of context, that question on the slide there. And really in your head, you had to ask yourself the question, what's trying to be achieved here? You know, what is our desired outcome? Because clearly it depends on what your desired outcome is, will change the way you will go about building that outcome. So if you've got a big tall skyscraper to build, you are going to need a different level of scaffolding to a set of homes on a new, you know, homing lot, you know, home lot with 100 new houses for people to live in. So what we need to be doing is getting really clear at the beginning what it is that we're actually trying to build so that we can then get clear what has to be in the workflow to build what we're seeking to build. And we're seeking to build behaviors here. But one way to think about that, if we use the scaffolding and building metaphor, is there's the architect's model. So you see, that's one home, and you're going to need some scaffolding to build that. But let's start with knowing where we're trying to get to. Start with the end in mind, as Stephen Covey obviously famously said. And then we can figure out, well, what do we need for foundations? What do we need for structure? What materials do we need to input into that? How do we get those materials interacting or joined together? Who else do we need to get involved? And so on. So until we know what this endpoint is, there's all these other things that then start to get pulled together. So it's really important we have that end thing. And in terms of learning and development, that architect's model there really in an L&D sense is a description of the behaviors that we are seeking to build or wanting these people to build within themselves. And if we're going to say, well, how do we know we're getting towards those behaviors? How do we know when they are happening or have happened or are now embedded? We need to be able to describe them in observable terms. So it's really, really important that when you are saying this is our desired behavioral destination from what we're doing here, you are describing that behavioral destination in terms that are observable, which means that your outcomes probably wouldn't use words like understand, because how on earth can you observe someone's understanding? You can observe what they do with that, and that's what's critical. So there's actually a bit of a mind shift there too in thinking about the learning outcomes. And in the language of the 12 levers that Melanie talked about 2 weeks ago, they are called transfer goals. So what are the goals of your transfer? Well, what are you trying to get people to move and transfer from your learning event out into the world? And then what are we going to observe out there? Because unless you can observe it, it's pretty tough to measure it. Now, of course, you might not actually observe the behavior. You might do a training course, for example, on report writing. What you can observe coming out of that is the result of that behavior, which is the report. So it might not be observing them actually do the report itself. It might be the output from that behavior. So that's just a sort of slight aside on measuring. But what we have, as I alluded to earlier, are these sort of wrapper phases. In order for a training course to work, you need to put a wrapper around it, a little bit before it, and then, of course, you've got the training course itself, and then something after it. See, most organizations focus, oh God, 95% of their effort on the during the training. But transfer happens a bit in the before and a bit in the during, and especially in the after part of what's going on here. And this is where technology can start coming to bear when you think about this wrapper or the workflow. So the wrapper is a workflow. If you think about it in those terms, so the technology can do things like, I don't know, send pre-workout to learners, brief managers on what's coming and what role they need to be playing, setting expectations about what application. It's what one or two of you mentioned in the chat is what does good look like? Is setting expectations on that, letting people know this is what we want out of this course from an organizational perspective. And oh, by the way, this is what's in it for you as an employee or a staff member here. Now, there's other things you can do with technology too. You can gather context about learners' roles and challenges. Somebody mentioned earlier in the chat about challenges or things that get in the way. So you can gather information around that even before the course, which can then feed into how that course is delivered on the day. We won't go into what you can do during, because clearly that's something I think we're all pretty good at. The bits we're not good at is the stuff that's wrapped around that. So afterwards, this is where technology, in my mind, really becomes critical if you want to do it at scale. There's an old saying, who plays the music when Elvis has left the building? So after training, the trainer has left, the people have left the classroom, a weekend has maybe happened, and now what? It's after training. This is where most programs fail badly to capitalize on what was done in the training room. And of course, if you don't do that, then the costs of putting those people in the training room is just frittered away, really. So a learning workflow wrapped around that training, and especially using technology to scale it, will orchestrate all of those kind of multiple touch points over weeks or months. Things like spaced activities, space practice, reflections, encouraging people, sit in the corner with your favorite drink and reflect on your newfound purpose as a supervisor. Micro learnings delivered to just upgrade little bits that they might need to know now that they perhaps didn't need to know earlier in order to take the next step in their journey. So this isn't about just rehashing or dumping more content on them. By the way, that's something I often see is, well, oh, we do lots of learning transfer stuff. We give them this portal with all of this extra content on it. And I'm thinking, what good is that going to do? If the content you've already given them isn't shifting them and making a change and getting them to do something different, why is giving them even more of that sort of content going to make a difference? So anyway, if in the building analogy, by the way, that's just like pouring more and more concrete into the foundations and not building up. So the sort of things that you can build into technology too is a manager touch point, guided conversations, check-ins, things like feedback opportunities so that the learner can get some really close, direct, customized almost input into their program. So we often talk about customized input, and technology can do that with AI and bits and pieces, but that tends to be changing content in order to suit where someone is at. But actually, what you need to do really is change the workflow subtly to do different things as it's in progress. And the only person that's going to be able to do that is a buddy or a manager who's close to the learner doing what they're doing during their building behavior journey. So that's where you can get technology to help with that. And that's also how, when you bring the manager into the equation, you can actually customize your learning journeys very effectively. Technology can give you prompts, can also help with measurement. And you need all of that in order to do that sort of sequence of stuff. And that's one of the things about workflows is there is that sequence there, and that's really important. And the technology will automate that sequence for you so nothing gets missed. So what we're really talking about is the kind of tech that can build a workflow and keep that running for you, and make sure the right people get the right nudges, the right bits of content, the right little activity prompts and things at the right time. So the magic's very much in the sequencing, time to, you know, when the things are needed. So like in week one, apply technique A. In week two, reflect on what worked. In week three, manage a check-in on the progress. So the technology makes that really happen at scale. And one of the things I've been talking about here often is the manager, because that's one of the 12 levers that Melanie talked about for learning transfer. And I heartily recommend getting really close to what those 12 levers are. I can give you some stuff later with a download for that as well. But here's another question for the chat. Just what are the biggest, if we're talking about managers, what are the biggest barriers to managers supporting transfer in your organization? I've got the chat open here as well. Thanks, Arash. But what what barriers stop the managers doing what they want? Time poor. Yep. I'm assuming people can see the chat and read it. So yeah, that's an interesting one. Oh, yes, Joe just said it won't be on the recording unless you read it out. Oh, there you go, Joe. Thanks. You're an expert at this. So the various things is that time poor, lack of space to apply learning in the flow of work. Um, in our organization, it's the time. Fear is one. Um, it Power struggle. That's an interesting one. There's no real culture of learning in the organization or not being trained on how to extract the value of training that their staff received. That's really important. And if they didn't attend the training themselves, how on earth, what are they, they don't often feel engaged with the follow-up, or they didn't weren't involved with preparing or helping with it. One example that Melanie used in the webinar 2 weeks ago, when she did some work with a big organization around this, is that actually a lot of managers were really quite keen to help. They wanted to, and they weren't even complaining about time. Their focus is we don't really quite know what to do. So there was too much friction. We don't know what to do, so we'll default to doing nothing. So I think that's important. So that's just a few things, in terms of barriers. Oh, and if it's a solo attendee, they don't have influence. It might not be in their gift to actually change. Yeah, so this is where they go back, and the manager actually isn't really helping very much when they get back to their desk. Manager intrinsically try to bring order and structure, but learning needs complexity and messiness. Yeah, inevitably learning, and when people start flexing their muscles with their new knowledge and doing stuff, there will be mistakes. Things won't go quite as people had hoped. So there's a lot of work around that you can do. Talk about ensuring or in making sure that the errors that people will make as they are trying out something new are contained and don't have consequences that are too significant to the organization. But that doesn't mean you don't want experimentation. So there's a balance to be struck there. I think we'll wander a bit far off topic if we head into that one. One of the things that there's a lot of information on this slide. Feel free to skim it through, but it's just the idea that you can, with technology, provide the manager with a sequence of things to do and the time at which point to do it. I sometimes call this a handrail. It's a way to say, make sure that the managers across an organization are actually doing things in concert, that there is a lot of joined up stuff. They're doing things in a consistent way across an organization. And I get that with the work that we do in the NHS and elsewhere, where they want assessment and approval, being put in place by managers on work that a learner is doing. But of course, they want that to be consistent so that those compliance and competency things are done properly. It's interesting. As I said, I talked about a handrail and I put handrail into Google Images. And this is one of the images that popped up. And I thought, that's a very interesting handrail. I think I'd be hugging the cliff there as well, to be quite honest. Um, but the handrail, the sorts of things technology can bring to the picture is checklists. And not just a big checklist at the beginning, but actually here's short, small checklists that we need to apply this now. We're at month 2 in this program. Here's the checklist that we have to do this month. And here's the checklist for month 3. So technology can enable you to really get involved with that workflow along the entire length of it in quite small increments. And that starts making things much, much more easy. It reduces friction. And particularly for the manager, it means they kind of know what to do next. Um, what one of our clients that uses our platform for a lot of onboarding, I talked to one of the managers there. He had a small support query about getting his login sorted out because he changed his email. And while he was on the phone, I just happened to answer it in the office, and I said, "Well, what do you think of it?" He said, "Oh, it's great." He said, "I used to have to put a lot of work into onboarding because I had my own spreadsheet, I had a list, and I had the checklists from the organization. But now I don't have to bother with any of that. I just log in and it tells me what to do next. And it also tells me what my new starter has got to do today in terms of their onboarding process." So for him, he was ecstatic because it helped saved him a huge amount of time and effort. Um, and so that's just an interesting, there's so many of those sorts of stories where technology can really help that whole process and get people through. Um, the other thing is nudges at the right moment technology can provide. So email, SMS, or anything like that. So just send when it's needed. It's the right thing at the right time. And they can be really short and actionable. So it's not like lots of emails or overflow. It's just, or even a text just saying, "Oh, this is what you're doing today." Okay, that's cool. And I know that. And of course, if people are on some kind of scheduled workflow and they start running behind schedule, a workflow system will notice that and be able to um, do something about that in terms of nudging that person, but also escalating it to their manager or assessor or to administrators or whoever. And that's part of this visibility thing is when you've got people operating on a technology platform, you get visibility of who's doing what, which is very different to giving them a workbook and saying, "Go and finish this," or something in terms of a paper workbook. So the technology can really make it easy. Um, and the easier you make it, chances are it's going to happen. So you're removing friction. It's really important to think about how can I do this in a way that makes it easy for those people to do what they need to do to build the behavior that collectively we all want to happen coming out the other end of this program. And so that's one of the things is keep thinking build. What are the activities that need to happen in order for them to build this behavior? How can we deliver those activities to these people in time, at the right place, and in a way that means they can, "Oh, I can do that. I'll grab it now." And one thing I've noticed, and I've done a lot of study on the sort of behavioral change from people like BJ Fogg from I think it's Harvard he's at. He gave me permission to put some of his work in my book on learning transfer. And it's just that if you ask somebody to do something quite big, they'll kind of balk at that, saying, "Well, I can't get that done easily now, and I'm not sure." And so they just won't start. Whereas if you give them 5 or 6 small tasks that collectively would be the same as the big one, they'll probably get those 5 or 6 smaller ones done because they'll get the first one and say, "Oh, I can do that now and take me 2 minutes," and they'll do it. And then the second one, 3 minutes. "Oh, I'll just do it, get it out of the way." Have you noticed that with your emails and other tasks? You'll just grab the small ones and do them to get rid of them. So and of course, as soon as you start doing that, you get lots of small tasks. And that's where that big 10,000 number came from or more, is in order to get lots of small nudges and small tasks, again, you've got to have technology. You could just say, here's one big task, go and do it. The chances of that happening are way, way smaller than giving people lots of little tasks that collectively build up to the same sort of thing as the big one. But what you've got to do too is make sure you don't just overcomplicate things with technology. I found that picture of a scaffold on a tower and it looked like a church or something. Quite incredible. Not easy. So good design is still important. It's not just about adding tech and then that's all you need to do. You need to be thinking about how do we design what we're doing, and then in order to help us do what we're doing, how do we utilize tech to do that? So we're back to this um, idea of scaffolding. And this picture's interesting too, because by the way, notice how easy it is to see from a distance, from maybe another set of scaffolding, what's going on. That visibility is a big thing that you get with tech. And certainly the customers that we deal with, that's one of their biggest benefits they say they get from it. So a little recap here. Um, there's really three key takeaways I just wanted to put in front of you from what I've been talking about. I hope they've come across. One is to think workflow and not events. Learning transfer requires a structured journey. And that's really important. The sort of the golden rule, make it ridiculously easy. Um, and if a manager has to log into three systems, search for information, and figure out what to ask, it's not going to happen. So use technology to remove friction. And the other one is provide the handrail. And this isn't just to the manager, by the way. We talked about the manager because I was kind of focusing on one of those 12 levers. And but it applies to the learner and potentially to other people who are in that process as well, who might be assessors and so on, or line managers. So if you want behavior at scale, building behavior at scale, you're going to need that. And also clearly you've got to have visibility, because without visibility, you really can't measure what's going on and then measure what's working now and measure how you are progressing towards your finished building. So the visibility is really important to give you measures that you can then cycle back and loop back to improve things. So it one of the things that is I hope it made you stop and think, number one, but also notice that what I'm sort of talking, I took one of those 12 levers from Melanie's webinar, and this is the manager one. And there's 11 other levers. So basically, for each of those levers, dig into it and thinking, how can tech help me pull this lever before, during, and after the training day? How can it help me do that? How can it spread the load? How can it help me build all of that? And you can look at that one lever at a time. And that's what makes that 12 levers model very effective, is it's splitting up the different things that need to be done into chunks that you can handle, and then look at them individually and then bring them all together again at the end. So I think that's hopefully it's just covered some stuff that's of interest. There's lots more, obviously, that we can talk about that. We've got a free giveaway for you guys. The book I did on learning transfer, it's 50%. So Arash will email out, once you Arash, a link to a page where you can just grab a copy of that, and we'll post it out to you. So that's just £7.50 for a book, and we'll even pay for the postage from free from this end, if you're in the UK, that is. And what we're going to do now is just head into some questions. If you want to get in touch with me, there's sort of my contact details. You're welcome to link up on LinkedIn. Ask me any questions about any of this stuff. I'll be delighted to talk with you in more detail. but we've got quarter of an hour left now. So put your questions in the chat, and if it's and we'll let's see where we get to. I would love to hear what you think of it and any questions or challenges, by the way, if you think what I said is not quite right. Oh, I've stunned everybody into silence, maybe. What are the other things? Oh, fog is at Stanford. Yes, you're quite right, Jose. Absolutely right. Um, Fog with a double G, if you want to look up his work. And there's, as I said, there's a chunk of that in the book that I wrote on learning transfer. So, and also, by the way, in the book is, I think it's on page 70, there is the 12 levers of learning transfer laid out. I've also got some ebooks which include that work as well. Plus, of course, you can get directly in touch with Melanie at Transfer Effectiveness. And Joe says, I think it all sounds reasonable. It's actually getting to actually do it. I think it's important to think about the friction that managers and learners face when they are trying to actualize what they've learned. Is I mean, it's almost like this. You've got a learning transfer problem coming out of this webinar. So you've learned something today, I hope. And and then what are you going to do with that? You're going to go back to your desk. Your email's probably been building up even for the hour that we've been talking here. What happens next? You sort of a learner leaves their training room and without the structure of a wrapper, a workflow, it's like a void. Where do they go from there? So we need to really set them up to do that. A question from Simon, apart from your own platform, what other tools have you found most useful? There's quite a few of the comms tools like Teams or Slack you can set stuff up on, is my understanding. I don't have not used them myself. And clearly some LMSs do have elements of this built into them, but by and large LMSs are content repositories, portals where you can go and get content. And they don't really do much with the afters, with what happens after someone's consumed that content. And that's really where a workflow tool needs to come into place. I believe our platform's relatively unique on the world stage, but there are certainly others who are doing some things along those lines in different areas. It would probably be remiss of me to talk about different brands here, but happy to have a conversation with you offline about that. What I don't want to do is get this into about my platform. Managers have the same problem from Jose as their learners changing their behaviors. So we need to work on them to be ready and prepared for learning. So perhaps there's a workflow there that needs to be done in terms of how to help managers become better at helping the learners in their team to get the best out of a learning program. Kate's sort of question, how to get a culture change in an organization in order to support this. Actually, I think it sounds difficult when you use the concept of culture change. Culture really is sort of an aggregation of the way we do things around here. So the way you change culture is to get people doing things differently. And you can usually start that with sort of small skunkworks projects with a little, get one small training course that's going to be for a few people and sort of build a learning transfer wrapper and workflow around that. And then you can start getting some data, start proving a point, and then you can apply that to another program. Most organizations have dozens sometimes of training programs running. So you can usually take one and put a wrapper around it and say, right, let's go all out on learning transfer for this one and then see if we can make it work here in our culture. And that also will help you understand within the culture where are the primary barriers to it, and start then giving you some numbers of what's going and what's happening. So yeah, I happy to again. I'm really happy to talk about any of this sort of stuff in detail as well. And in more relevance to your own organization. So, Kate, if you wanted to get in touch on LinkedIn, happy to have a chat about that. But hopefully that makes sense initially in terms of a way to think about culture. Is start small with little bits. And also think about it as a top down and bottom up. A lot of people say, oh, culture, you've got to start at the top. And then others say, culture, you start at the bottom. I think you've actually got to do both, in my opinion. Do we have any other comments or questions here?
I have a quick question, Paul.
Yeah, sure.
Just just curious as to, I know we talked about um, so the like guardrail for managers specifically and how technology can uh, help with that. What have you seen any really good examples in organizations where people have almost I don't want to say like done it well on a budget, so they've done it using tools that are easily accessible as opposed to having to invest in a platform that kind of takes care of it all. So I suppose still using technology, but using tech like low tech solutions or solutions that are easily accessible that you might
Yeah.
already have access to.
Okay. There's a number of things out there you can make use of for free. I mean, Google Docs and Forms and things like that. As I said, there's Slack and Teams, which may already be there. Um, some organizations already have, workflow type things like Monday.com or whatever. So there's lots of stuff like that that you can bend into a learning workflow. But what we have seen is that they are being bent. It's a square
Mm,
peg in a round hole, and eventually they've ended up spending more time. And if you attribute a cost to that time, that means they've actually spent more money than getting something specialist for it. So we've seen that in the NHS, for example, where they say, "Well, we haven't got any money, we'll build our own," and then sometime later they're saying, "Actually, it's probably cost us more in the long run to
mm,
do." Um, Plus, the results we got were okay, but we could have done better. And in the meantime, we've lost those benefits. Um, so, yes, you can roll your own. And I'd probably recommend doing that in the very early stages so you can start playing with bits almost for free to start getting a sense of where the barriers are and what's possible and what's not within your particular context. And also to see what the appetite is for those with checkbooks and budget to do something, because you kind of need to go with them through a business case. I mean, we work with people to help them build a business case for internal use. But sometimes that business case ends up, well, we're not going to get a platform at all. We're going to do something a lot smaller, but do it ourselves and roll our own, at least for a while. And that's
mm.
fine too. Andy's put a comment, agree completely, must affect behavior of both learners and managers and peers if we want to extract value of learning and application in the workplace that brings about positive change. Otherwise, the old adage of training is just a cost will not change. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it has to be seen as an investment, as something that's worth doing, because it will benefit the company and the costs of doing so. And that's part of the ROI type case that we, will help organizations to build for their internal sort of stuff. Um, I've just got in the Q&A, I noticed there was a little question mark, and Jose's put, how are new habits made? Um, I'd probably go back to BJ Fogg's work, the Stanford guy, to look at that. But habits are really something that you do by default, by habit. It's something that you've done so often, you're on autopilot for it. And they can be habits we don't like chewing your fingernails, or habits of the way we drive our car, habits of the way we treat other people. But generally, a habit will come yeah, I mean, Andy Davis, practice, then becomes a habit. The way you do things regularly will burn in those neural networks. And then that becomes a habitual, it lays down a line in your neural networks that then means it goes on to autopilot. But you can change that. There are ways to do that. BJ Fogg's work is very good at that. But the other thing that's interesting to think about is that four stages of competence where you're unconsciously incompetent, and then consciously incompetent, and then consciously competent, and then finally unconsciously competent. And it's only when you get to that final stage of unconsciously competent that you can say, well, that's now a habit. I do that without thinking about it. I mean, driving, for example, is a skill, a habitual skill, if you want to put those two words together. So, yeah, practice, practice, practice. But practice doesn't make perfect, by the way. Practice just makes what you're doing something that becomes embedded. So, proper practice or diligent practice or practice that is seeking improvement is where you are actually saying, I'm going to practice this to get to this different outcome to what I'm getting right now because I want to improve the way I'm doing it. So you've got to be thinking about practice a bit differently too. I think we're probably getting pretty close to time. So
Yeah, well, yeah, massive thanks once again, Paul, for a brilliant session and really appreciate you sharing your time and your insights with us. As we mentioned at the beginning of the call, the recording will be available to members in the members area as well as our YouTube channel. And if you've enjoyed today's session and you're not a member, you can join the Learning Network for just £29 a year at thelearning-network.org. Massive thanks again to Paul and to everybody that's joined us today. And yeah, we'll leave it there. Appreciate your time, everybody. Thank you.
brilliant. Okay. Thanks, everybody. And
Thanks.
do get in touch if you want to talk about it further. All the best.